Are you looking to get into Lorcana? Have you figured out what kind of budget that you want? What kind of decks that you like? How difficult they might be, or even what deck is even meta? And on top of that, there's a lot of different directions to even go with that. So we're going to be looking into all of that and more so that you can have the best chance at being successful in picking which deck you would like, as well as which one will be competitive. All of that and more right now. So I got into Lorcana probably back in October, give or take, and there was a lot of questions that I necessarily had. First off, I was diving into all these different websites with Google searches, which decks are competitive, which ones are performing well. And unfortunately, there was a lot that just was not popping up any helpful results. And I found a website that had a kind of helpful list, and they said, what they felt was the tier list. Okay, cool, that's great. Except that it was slightly wrong in a lot of the ways, saying what tier 2 was, what tier 3 was, and then even so, you're saying what all of these decks are, but I was a brand new person that just wanted to get into competitive Lorcana, and I had no idea what any of these cards meant, and I barely knew even how to play the game. And so, even though I had plenty of experience with different card games and things of that nature, even playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic the Gathering, I still had next to no idea. So, it was very difficult. But I really wanted to make sure that my girlfriend and I could get into it and get into it successfully. And so, I chose for myself, we just had the Las Vegas LCQ, which was great. And so, I went on to the leaderboard on Ink Decks, somehow fell into that, which was great. And I picked for myself the second place winner Ruby Amethyst deck, knowing literally nothing about the deck but that it got second place. Okay, cool. So that helps. And I got that deck, called it good, and I bought my girlfriend an EA deck because it felt like, it was performing decently well in set 5 and it was awesome. Okay, cool. But then it got here and everything, and it necessarily wasn't even a deck that I liked. I knew it was able to perform well, but I just didn't really like how it was feeling, the jankiness of it, the bounce back kind of, combos that you were looking at. They all felt good, but it just wasn't necessarily a deck that I loved, and that's very difficult to have to deal with. And at the same time, my girlfriend loved the deck, but we found out, especially this being her first card game, she wanted to be a little bit more of a race to the finish aggro player that wanted to not necessarily have to worry about the board state as much, because her being so new into card games, she's like, oh, well, I just don't really know what anything does. I don't want to really spend a whole ton of time learning the meta, learning what all the cards do, and things like that. I just want to sit down, have a fun game, and stand a chance. And it was like, okay, cool. So that's really good to know. And after that, we went ahead and we built her an aggro deck with Amber Steel. Now, for someone who is brand new, like you probably are, what does all of that even mean? Whew, that's a little much. Well, we are going to be diving into all of that. Now, there are some ground rules that you need to know about this game in particular. First and foremost, this is probably one of the best competitive games to be able to join, because the gateway into this game is very safe in the sense of that this meta is very wide open. There are a lot of great decks. We are going to be looking into 6 different decks and like 5 different color combinations throughout this video. And so that'll be really helpful and being a good time for you. At the same time, though, there are also no bans and no rotations. What that necessarily means is that cards, if they are too powerful or if a deck is being too dominant, then the game is going to come out and say, hey, we are banning this card. And therefore, the community needs to alter their decks accordingly to follow the rules of this game. Currently, right now, actually, there are no bans, which is great. All the cards are fairly balanced. People do think that, like, a Diablo is going to be banned. It doesn't necessarily need to. My vote is Prince John, in particular, needs to get banned. Maybe even Muses, but, it's such an irrelevant deck right now. But we're going into, my PTSD of Lorcana, so we don't need to dive into that too much. Anyway, so that's the nicest part, though. No bans and no rotations. Now, what a rotation means is that when we have a ton of sets that are out, games generally like to try to keep the game fresh, and so they won't necessarily have the oldest sets be tournament legal, so that people try to build sets or cards and decks with the sets that are most recently released. And so, that's perfectly fine. What's really cool though is we've had 6 sets released so far and we've had 0 rotation thus far. There is still a very high chance that we are going to have a rotation, especially when we're going to be going up to probably 10 sets by the end of this year, early next year, probably next January in 2026. February, Marchish, we're going to have our 10th set be released. We are currently in set 6, which is Sail the Azurite Sea. Or not Sail the Azurite Sea, Azurite Sea. There's a card called Sail the Azurite Sea. Anyway, with that being said, though, there's a lot of really exciting things to be able to have and look forward to, and this game is absolutely great. Now, understand as well, the decks that we are going to be looking at, they are going to be relevant until probably March 9th. After that, the next set is going to be released. Now, what that's going to mean is that there are going to be 204 brand new cards that are going to be released into the world of Lorcana, where deck builders can build to their heart's content. There also is a brand new mechanic that we aren't going to dive into too much just so we don't overwhelm you with anything. That is going to, completely change what decks could potentially be meta decks. Now, of course, that still is, a month and a half, 2 months ahead. By the time you watch this video, probably not. But but still, the decks that we are going to be necessarily looking at should still be meta relevant in some way, shape, or form by the time or by this next set as well. And during this next set, with the potential of just needing to switch out maybe, a couple of cards to be able to continue to be competitive in the next set. The nice part is when a new set does come out, though, it's going to be meta, or it's going to be the set that is out and only out kind of thing for about 3 to 4 months. And so luckily that's a good amount of breathing space. You're able to get the cards that you need, change some things, and there's a particular thing where you might not even need to necessarily change your deck. You will still be relevant. You just won't necessarily have the brand new cards that you need. So, with all that said, though, let's go ahead and look into the decks that will be meta relevant for you as you go ahead and look into this. Now, we are going to be diving into the budget of things, how much money you need to necessarily spend to be able to afford this deck. That's a very big deal. If you only have $150, well, we got a couple of decks that will go ahead and help you out. If you want to go ahead and spend more like $400, well, we got those decks as well. The nice part about Lorcana, though, is for a competitive game that you're going to be going to game stores and tournaments and things like that with, this game is relatively cheap. Way cheaper than Yu-Gi-Oh, way cheaper than Magic the Gathering, but not as cheap as Pokemon. But then again, you don't want to necessarily go against a bunch of 10-year-olds. Now, if you're also worried about what decks I'm talking about and where they fit on a tier list, I got a video for you as well where I go in and dive into where I feel all the tiers are in this game as we, as the meta currently stands. And so, anyway, guys, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the decks. Now, understand these are going to be all tier 1 decks or the best decks in the meta currently, but they're not going to be in necessarily any order. For example, like Ruby Sapphire is probably the best deck in this game, followed by probably Ruby Amethyst. Now, we're going to be diving into this deck first, and the reason for that is because this color combination is probably the safest color combination for you to dive into. Now, why is that? Well, first and foremost, Amethyst is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful color in the game. It's just absolutely dominant. It has some great mechanics. And if you go ahead and get into Purple or Amethyst, as it is called, then you will be able to go into other deck types pretty easily. And it's the same thing with Steel or the gray color, where you are going to be able to, of course, go ahead and dive into a bunch of different decks. We have, Amethyst Steel, we have Amber Steel, then we have, Blurple, for example, which is blue and purple. We have Ruby Amethyst, which is red and purple, and we have Emerald Amethyst, which is, there's just a ton of different color combinations, all of which pretty much derive with these two decks, or these two deck colors, and that is a very helpful thing. Because, of course, if you do find out that this might not be the deck that you necessarily like, it is very easy for you then to hop over to another one. So, what makes this deck so fun and awesome? Well, the biggest thing is that it does have a good amount of board presence and things things of that nature. And it is very helpful to be able to get you going on, hitting the ground running while then still being able to play mid to late game and control the rest of the deck. This deck can be a little bit difficult to be able to pilot, not a whole ton. But the biggest thing with this deck is that you are going to need to balance, your character abilities and timings. The hardest part is also sometimes figuring out what your good mulligan is and when you need to put certain cards back, and even so, when you need to ink certain cards, because even if you do make those kinds of mistakes, any and all decks are going to be horrible. Now, of course, this is a little bit older of a deck list. For example, Smash isn't necessarily being played anymore. It's going to be Strength of Raging Fire. That's also an $11 card. That's kind of expensive. But with this deck in particular, you're going to be looking at spending, between probably $250 and $300 on this deck in particular. Now, is that a lot? Yes, but there are some certain cards that you could necessarily switch out, like for example, the genies down here in the middle. You're going to be able to switch out for rabbits, which are a lot cheaper, and also 4 genies aren't necessarily going to be played anymore as often. The Tinkerbells are still a little bit expensive. The Long Came Zeus's are about $5. Everything else, though, is actually relatively cheap. Calhoun's are still about $6 to $7. Of course, all of this is USD and whatnot. But there are still, with every deck that we are also going to be talking about, this is going to be more, there's always going to be kind of a budget-friendly one, which might not be as good, but it still will be competitive. And with that, you could probably even go down to spending maybe 175, 150 if you're lucky, and being able to pick everything up. For example, if you do play Smashes instead of Strength of Raging Fire. And so, anyway, with that being said, though, this is a great deck to be able to get into the meta, get into the game. It's called mid-range because it's going to have some good speed in the beginning, sure, to be able to establish your board and to be able to take care of your opponent's threats as they arise. And then towards the mid to late game, you're going to hopefully be able to take control. The big thing about this deck is that it has characters that have pretty good abilities, being able to attack in and control the board, but it also has actions that are able to help you remove the enemy characters. And so, all in all, this is a pretty fun deck with the difficulty of actually not too bad. The fox targets might be because the fox goes ahead, you play the card, you have to put one card back into your hand that's on the field, that's a character. And sometimes that timing is going to be a little bit weird where like, oh, I should have quested with, my character first and then bounced him back to my hand. But those are very easy timings to be able to get control of, especially with as you continue to play, even 3 games in, you're going to fix a lot of these kings. Now, Pete's going to be a really good one too. And this is going to dive into how well also do you know the rest of the meta that you are going to be diving into, because a Pete will be really good, but if you play at turn 4, against a Ruby Amethyst deck, you're not necessarily going to be doing a whole lot, But if you play at turn 6, and that stops them from being able to prepare you, which wipes your entire board on turn 7, then of course, again though, for the answers and the board presence and the overall chance of winning that this deck has, it is winning store championships. It's not necessarily winning any major tournaments, but it's still doing pretty good. And so, with that being said, though, this is still a pretty fun deck, not too difficult to pilot, and all in all, a pretty fun deck that has pretty much everything that you can encompass. It might be a little bit aggressive, but it also might be a little bit slower for those that are going to be going into the long game. So, really, really fun deck. This is going to be one of the most popular decks, but this is also going to be one of the hardest decks to be able to actually own just because it is so expensive. You're going to be looking to spending between $300 and $500 to get this deck. And we are also going to talk about this color combination, which is Amber Steel. Now, the difficult thing about this deck color combination is that it does have some very expensive cards in it, just because the card that you in particular need is going to be your draw power, which is going to be the Rapunzel in the middle of the board. Everything else is actually relatively cheap, again, except for Strength of the Raging Fire, which is the action down here, right here. With that, though, that's the difficult part about this whole scenario, is that there are going to be a little bit of expensive cards that you necessarily need. With Amber, though, you're not going to necessarily be able to shortcut this deck in the sense of making a budget friendly, because the Rapunzels are just so needed to be able to get the card draw going that it's going to be a little bit tough. Now, this one is in particular is a deck type called Diggy Diggy Hole, or, because it has the Dwarven Mine in it, and then it has the Dark Dock and the Happy Knights. Now, the reason why this deck is so good is because it is one of the most aggressive decks in the game. You are able to hit the ground running, getting a lot of characters out. Cinderella will be able to sing a song with Let the Storm Rage On or with Strength of the Raging Fire to basically, if you go first, you play Cinderella, they play something, you blow up what they put out, and then you're able to play another character or even two characters out onto your board and go from there. It's just got a really good board presence. It's got the ability to move through, and this deck is relatively straightforward. This is probably one of the easiest decks to play in the game. Yes, there is still going to be some decision making, and yes, it does suck with like Daisy, for example, which is probably still a $6 to $7 card. You're gonna have your opponent who has the chance to get another card every time that Daisy quests, but she's a 1 cost for a 1/4 willpower and whatnot that is able to quest for 2, and so it is just a very good card that has the ability. Now, of course, again, the expensive cards in this deck are going to be the Daisy Ducks, the Calhoun's, which is also like $7. The Docks are, I think they've gone up to about 10. The Strength of a Raging Fire, the action that we talked about, is $11. The Rapunzels are between $38 and $45. And that's about it. Everything else is probably about, 10 cents to about $1.50 a card, which isn't necessarily all that bad. But when you have to buy, $150 of, filler cards, for to help fill out the deck, and then, $180 on 4 cards on top of that, it can add up. But the biggest thing is this is going to be probably one of the safest colors, especially going into this next set, just because of how good it is in general. There's a lot of great things to look forward to with this deck. Again, it is so easy to be able to pilot this deck. You don't necessarily need to know the rest of the meta. You just need to know that I need to hit the ground running fast. I need, a Daisy in my hand, a Cinderella, and a Rapunzel, and everything else might necessarily be a little bit irrelevant, or it's nice to be able to fill out. Some things are really nice to know as well, where it's like, oh, well, if I'm going against Ruby Sapphire, then I need, daisies in my hand, Lilos, Piglets, Smees even, kind of thing, to try to get to 20 lore as fast as possible, kind of thing. So, there's certain things that you definitely need to adjust for, but that's how it is with any deck. And so, but this deck, again, it's expensive, yes, but it is going to be one of the best decks and one of the best ones for you to hit the ground running at your local game store with the minimal amount of learning curve for you. And so anyway, this is going to be great for you. Really easy to be able to learn, like we've said, and all in all, I think this is going to be a great deck for the foreseeable future. All right, well, I wanted to zoom in properly. Not going to. Oh well. It's going to be Blurple. Now, this is going to be actually a pretty great deck, especially for the budget. This one's not going to necessarily be all that expensive. You're going to be looking at between 150 and 200, depending on the cards that you want to get. Yes, though, there are still going to be some expensive cards in the set, but it's not going to necessarily be all that bad. Now, the biggest thing about Blurple is I'm going to say that this is probably one of the hardest decks to have to pilot. There's a lot that has to go right for you. It's not necessarily going to be the best of the best deck necessarily. And there are some matchups in this meta that necessarily can devastate you. You go against discard, and you're going to have a very difficult time. At the same time, though, if you really like the late game, if you really want to get into just controlling the late game and getting ahead and just having a great time doing it, this is a great deck. You're still going to be able to have some good board presence in the beginning of the game, but there are still going to be things that you need to do to try to get up to 6, 7, 8 ink so that you can go ahead and get out your big creatures like your Hades and your Elsas, which are going to be the game changers to get you back into the game. The first 4 or 5 turns, your opponent is going to be able to basically hit the ground running, do their thing within reason. You might be able to play a Fox or things like that to mitigate the damage, but the more that you play these characters out, the slower your deck ends up going on getting to the higher ramp And you got to kind of balance that out, which makes it so difficult to be able to pilot. I will say that Blurple is probably going to be the hardest deck to pilot that we talk about next to probably EA. Now, with that being said, this is still an absolutely great deck, but you need to know what you are going against and how to properly answer those with what you have. If you mess up also on your mulligans, the rest of your game is going to be absolutely difficult. Um, at the same time, too, again, keep in mind though, this deck is going to necessarily change. Where not everyone is going to be running 4 of the genies. You're going to necessarily be running 2 genies and 4 rabbits. Keep in mind though, too, there are always going to be different deck lists. Look on ink decks to go to see, which decks are going to be the top decks, and pick one that did well. There's a lot of decks that have done well. Pick ones that have gone in more of the 50-player tournaments kind of thing, or higher. The more players, the better, because they've had to prove themselves against bigger competition, especially in the late of the competition, because those winners went against the winners to be able to determine who was the ultimate winner. That's how tournaments work. Anyway, so with that being said, though, this is still a really great deck. But again, this is going to be more of a race to the finish on getting to the 6, 7, 8 lore. You're not going to have a whole ton of removal because that's just what this deck doesn't necessarily do. It just really controls the board and it lets you get ahead. You're going to go ahead and play an Elsa, and your 2 of your opponent's characters are going to be unable to untap at the beginning of their turn. And then you could necessarily take them out, or you could just go ahead and bounce back the Elsa after questing with her for 3 by playing a snake, and then you play her again, and you do the same thing over again. Same with the Hades. Hades is really your only removal, really, just because that you are able to go ahead and play Hades and select a character to go into their ink well exerted. But that's the hard part. If your opponent ends up going too wide, then you're going to be in trouble, and that's going to be very difficult. So you got to kind of make sure that you have good board control while also making it to the end game so that you have the best chance of coming back, because you are going to be most likely playing from behind and then going forward and trying to win. Again, though, this is a very budget-friendly deck because you only have to spend, 150 to maybe 200. The Elsas are $15. The Hades are, 7 to 10 depending. Genies, you probably need 2 or 3, give or take, depending on what you like. And that's going to be around $13 to $15. And then other than that, though, everything else is actually relatively cheap. Everything's going to be between $2 and, maybe 10 cents. So really, really not a bad budget deck at all if you want to get into this. Again, though, it is going to be one of the hardest decks for you to pilot. Amethyst Emerald, or EA as they call it. I just didn't feel like changing it in Photoshop because Amethyst was in pretty much all the decks that I had already done for this slideshow. Now, at the same time, Amethyst Emerald, really interesting deck. Now, this is going to be a very difficult deck. The reason that is in particular is because this deck isn't necessarily going to have any removal. What I mean by that is that, in Steel, you have Fire the Cannons, you have a Long Cane Zeus, you have Strength of Raging Fire, you have all of these cards that are going to be able to just take out your opponents with actions that your characters could potentially sing or that you pay for manually. Amethyst Emerald, the only way to actually get rid of your opponent's field is going to be by literally attacking into it. At the same time, these decks can be very aggressive and have a very dangerous board presence to really help get you to that 20 to win the game. We have the Cursed Merfolk, which are able to quest for 2. When it gets taken out, then your opponent discards a card if it is taken out via a challenge. Go-Go is a really, really great card, and it's only about still, I think, $2.50 to $3. And when you play Go-Go, if you pay 2 additional or 4 total with Go-Go, then you are going to be able to gain lore equal to the amount of damage on a opponent character. And that also means that if your opponent has 4 damage on a character, you're able to gain 4 lore, which could very well win you the game. Otherwise, other than that, the only thing that you really have kind of for removal is going to be a Cloud Kicker. Otherwise, you're going to have to attack in with everything and kind of finesse the game. And that kind of makes this tech a little bit difficult to actually have to pilot. That's the hard part. At the same time, though, again, this is probably one of the most budget-friendly decks. You can build this deck for about $125 to maybe $200, depending on the deck cards that you need in this deck. Again, the genies are going to be the most expensive thing, but again, a lot of people are running 2 genies and 4 rabbits, and the rabbits aren't necessarily all that expensive. I think they're like $4. And there's certain changes that you're going to see people making, playing like 3 Ursulas, maybe playing one big Ursula, which is going to be a $12 card. Um, you know, but everything else is relatively cheap. You got the Go-Go's, which are $2. The Diablos are 40 cents. Chernobogs are probably 150 to $2. So all in all, this is going to be a very, very, very cheap deck, and you're able to hit the ground running with this deck pretty successfully. And so, I mean, this is going to be a great deck for you. Again, though, the hardest part is you got to be able to know what trades are going to be good for you in this meta. If you're going to be playing bonsais, for example, which are 3/2s that can quest for 2 for a 2 cost, that's a great card. Not in this deck list, but again, if you want to go ahead and play that, then you need to figure out, okay, when is a good time for me to quest with this character? When is a good time for me to trade in to an opposing character kind of thing? And that's going to be how your entire game is going to go. And if you're unable to understand like those certain trades and board state and going in, then this can be a kind of difficult deck for you to be able to pilot. Again, though, this has a really great matchup against the best deck in the game, which is going to be Ruby Sapphire. And it's able to hold its own against other decks. Now, it does struggle against Amethyst Ruby, which we are going to be talking about soon. And, but that is perfectly acceptable. And you're still going to be able to do really good. Again, this is kind of like the same thing as the Amethyst Steel deck, where it doesn't necessarily win a ton of tournaments, but it's definitely going to be placing in the tournaments, and you have the ability to be able to win some very good decks against some very top decks. And this is a tier 1 deck, of course, so you're going to be able to do good. Again, this is probably one of the most budget-friendly decks, even over Blurple. And the ease to pilot this deck is going to be even easier than Blurple, so this is going to be a great gateway deck to help get you into the game. Again, it just happened to not be the deck that my girlfriend necessarily didn't want to play, just because, she wanted less thinking and more just playing and having her opponent react to her board instead of her having to really worry about her opponent's board. So kind of fun. But all in all, this is a really fun deck and an absolutely great game to be able to bring to your opponent. Amethyst Ruby. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a tricky deck in the sense, again, this is going to be one of the hardest decks for you to pilot. Now, I still think Blurple, of course, is going to be a little bit more difficult to be able to pilot, but this, I would say, is probably the second hardest deck. Now, that's not to say or deter you from this deck in particular. It's still going to be an absolutely great deck. This is probably the second best deck in the game currently, next to Ruby Amethyst or Ruby Sapphire. Sorry, and so that's going to be the biggest thing here. It's going to be. I would even people would even argue that this very well could be the first best deck. Now, again, this is going to be kind of the same thing where you're able to kind of hit the ground running with a little bit of aggro, kind of. But the biggest thing is that late game, whatever your opponent puts out, you're going to be able to have answers for. The biggest thing is that Flynn Rider, of course, is going to be a great beginning piece of your deck, because if you put him out and you have the highest attack out of all of your characters compared to all of their characters, then Flynn Rider will gain you 3 lore every single turn at the beginning of your turn. And that really helps with Sisu, which is little Sisu right there. Because she has the attack she gets +1 attack for each card in your opponent's hand. So you play 2, you go Flynn Rider, play 3, you go Little Sisu, and they're able to then go ahead and gain you some lore. Going against also Ruby Sapphire, you get a Flynn Rider out, there's not going to be a whole lot that they're going to be able to do to stop you from gaining lore within reason. They'll still be able to maybe ice block and then Little Sisu you kind of thing to remove the Flynn Rider, or brawl as well as normally something. But all in all, if you're able to get your Flynn Rider going off even 2 turns, you're already so far ahead. Now, this is something that we haven't necessarily seen a lot in these decks, and that's going to be locations. Again, this is actually going to be a pretty budget-friendly deck as well. Within reason, it's going to be kind of a mid-tier budget, where you could build something like this. For example, this deck, I think, was about $150, $175. But what you also could see as well is going up to even as much as $250 if you want to play 4 big Sisus or whatever else you might want to play. But all in all, this deck necessarily isn't going to be all that expensive. The only really expensive cards is going to be the Big Sisu, which is the blue dragon over there. It's going to be right now it's about a $29 card, and the only reason for that is because Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire did incredibly well at the North American Championships, and so immediately everyone picked up those cards, and that made everything extremely expensive for at least Big Sisu. Everything else shot up a little bit, but not a whole ton. Anyway, so that's going to be the most expensive card in your deck. But still, this deck is still absolutely dominant. Has great board presence. Again, it has the bounce back mechanics that can really help you out. And it's going to be a great color combination for a long time. It's going to be really interesting to see how this changes at the next set. But still, you're able to just go ahead, and the thing that this thrives on is card draw. And card draw is king in Lorcana. If you're able to have a ton of cards in hand, you're able to do a heck of a ton of answers, which is awesome. And again, it's really not that expensive to get pretty much the second, maybe even arguably the first best deck in the game. This is going to be probably a mid to almost late tier on difficulty to pilot. It is going to be a little bit harder. It is kind of easy if you get a little bit behind. For you to kind of catch up, you're going to have to understand the board state. You're going to have to understand what deck your opponent is playing and how to best counter your opponent's deck, or how to best give you the best advantage in the matchup. And so the knowledge that is needed in this deck is a little bit higher than, say, all the other decks that we have necessarily talked about thus far. But still, once you understand the meta that you are going against, and even once you understand on a deeper level how this deck in particular works, it could be just an absolute game changer, and you can do really well at your locals and even better at your store champ. But again, it's going to be a difficult deck to try to learn, but don't let that deter you. It's going to be still a really, really awesome deck. And I love this deck. Just didn't necessarily 100%, flow with me, but that's okay. I still love it. Now, pretty much last but not least, this is going to be the Ruby Sapphire here. Now, we have one more deck that we are going to be talking about after this, but this is going to be the best of the best deck. Now, with Ruby Sapphire, you're going to be looking at spending between 250 and 350 on this deck. And again, that's only going to come down to pretty much three different play sets of cards that you are necessarily going to need. The Maleficent Dragons, it's a 9 cost, but it's also going to be an $18 card. The Sisus are going to be a $29 card. The Mauis are a $7 card. The Maui Sharks are going to be a $30 card. And things of that nature. Tamatoas, they're cheaper now, which is good. I think around $7 if I remember correctly. The Prepareds, again, a little cheaper. I think around $7. And then Lucky Dime, I think, has severely fallen off the market just because of how the meta has changed from set 5 to set 6. Now, this is one of the most dominant decks, if not the most dominant deck in the game. It's we're going to try to get to the end game as fast as possible with the most amount of cards in hand that we could possibly get, and then we are just going to dominate the game by removing anything and everything to our joy. That's going to be the biggest thing. Now, with that being said, this is also going to be probably one of the easiest decks for you to be able to pilot in this game. I would even say next to Amber Steel, this is even maybe a little bit easier than that, because once you go ahead and get to the end game, the deck really kind of plays itself. It's like, oh no, the opponent has, all these characters out. Well, I'm going to be prepared and wipe all the characters. Oh, that sucks. And then they rebuild their board, and you're like, oh, well, I can go ahead and ice block, the Pete, for example, make him have 2 attack. Oh, I'm going to play a Sisu now. All characters with 2 attack are gone from the game. Cool. Oh, you played 1 character. That's great. I'm going to play a Maleficent Dragon. And oh, that 1 character you played last turn is now gone. That's why this deck is so dominant, just because you are able to control the end game and just climb right back up to the very top and win the game. That can be very annoying for a lot of people who go against this deck, but again, this is probably going to be one of the easiest decks. Now, this is on the higher end of the expensive side of this deck, but all in all, it's still, pretty cheap for competitive card games. Now, this is again going to be one of the, if not the best deck in the game, and this is probably going to even carry over super well to the next set as well. I think that Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, and Amber Steel are going to be your safest decks into this next set. Now, with Duel Link cards, there's a lot of new decks that could possibly creep up and really make an impact, which will be really interesting to see, but we won't go into that. Now, again, this deck is going to be a great deck for a long time. We thought it necessarily was going to kind of fall away out of tier 1 a little bit with this new set just because of how fast the meta then changed. But even so, this meta didn't necessarily change. It got a little bit faster, but Ruby Sapphire was able to adjust properly, especially with Sail the Azurite Sea, just really helping to speed it up. Pirate's Life now becoming relevant is just a really good card. And then the end game can be just so dominant for you that there's just very little that your opponent can do. But if you miss on a removal, then your opponent can take the game. And so that's kind of the risk and reward of playing this deck. Because by the time you really start making an impact to the game, your opponent might be between 12 and 16 lore. And so one little slip up, and they have the game. Still, though, this is an absolute great deck. Really fun to play. Pretty easy to pilot. A little difficult to make mistakes on, but again, this is going to be one of the most expensive decks that you are going to play. And the final deck, Amber Steel. Now, why is that the final deck? Well, because we looked at the first deck, which was the Diggy Diggy Hole deck. This one is a little bit different because you have something called Singers, which is Ariel, Cinderella, Ursula, maybe Prince Naveen, things of that nature. And the reason why this deck is also so good is because your characters sing songs to remove your opponent's board, and then you still have all of your ink to be able to continue to build your board. And that's why this deck is so dominant. You play an Ariel, you're able to grab a song out of the top 4 cards of your deck and add it right to your hand, and then, your Cinderella very well might be able to sing it. If not for the next turn, then Ariel is going to be able to sing it. I mean, there's just a whole lot of craziness in this deck. And so there's a lot of fun that can really come from it. Now, Steel Song is a little bit falling back on the meta right now, just because it is a little bit more difficult for it to be able to keep up with the rest of the meta. The hardest thing with this is that once you run out of cards, you can really get into a lot of trouble. At the same time, though, this deck is still, again, going to be extremely aggressive and pretty good at doing what it does best. You're going to be able to go ahead and hit the ground running and, get some really great things going your way. And especially if you're going against even like a Ruby Sapphire, you're going to be able to do a really good job. You're going to have to understand a little bit on what a good hand is, what that looks like, but that necessarily is not going to be a bad thing. You also don't necessarily need to understand the meta on a deep level. The deck is going to be able to play itself. You just take out the most dangerous card on their side of the board with a song, and you're good to go. And so, again, though, this is going to be a bit more on the expensive side because we have the Rapunzels, we have the Daisies. A Whole New World is still, I think, about an $8 to $10 card. Strength of Raging Fire, like we said, is an $11 card. We have Robin Hoods, which are a $20 card. We have the Simbas, which are still, I think, an $8 card. Daisy is a $7 card. Ariel, I think, is a $3 card. But all in all, you're looking at spending between $300 to $400, and that could be a lot of money. And so, still, though, this is an absolutely great deck. It could be a really fun deck to play. Might not be one that your opponent necessarily enjoys going against, but, well, that's how the game goes. Anyway, but this is a great deck and pretty easy to actually pilot as well once you understand how your songs work. And so that's going to be a really fun mechanic for you. So I hope that this helped you dive into this game a little bit better and know where you need to go to be able to get this going. At the same time, go ahead if you are looking at any deck lists. These decks might not be relevant deck lists, for example. They're a little bit older. I just showed them for, talking about purposes. If you do want to look at competitive decks, go ahead and go on Index. It is a great website, and go to the tournament slab. And again, look for tournaments that had more than 50, but even more than 100 people is going to be good. Or maybe even do what I did, go to the NA Championships and go ahead and pick one of the top decks and just buy that deck straight up. It's going to be good. It's been tried and tested by the player who piloted it, and it's going to be absolutely great for you as well. So what do you guys think about this? What decks are you looking forward to getting into? Go ahead and let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, guys, have a good one.